Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more epic tales every day. Liking this video helps us bring you more incredible stories, so smash that like button if you're ready for more. What would you do if you were in this situation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Which part of this story surprised you the most? Share your reactions in the comments. I love reading what you think. If you could add one twist to this story, what would it be? Let's get creative in the comments. What do you think happens next in the human versus alien saga? Let's discuss your theories below. The world around him was a desolate expanse of barren, cracked earth, stretching endlessly in every direction. Dust storms stirred faintly in the distance, their gritty edges catching in the weak sunlight. The pilot's hands gripped the manual controls as the alarms in the cockpit screamed at him, warning of critical damage. The ship wasn't going to hold. He wrestled with it, trying to keep it steady as he sought a place to land. No, not land, crash. His ship careened through the thick, dusty atmosphere of the planet, fighting him every step of the way. Metal groaned under the strain, and sparks flew from failing instruments. The ground rushed up fast, a jagged, rocky surface that looked as unforgiving as space itself. He braced for impact. With a sickening jolt, the ship hit, skidding across the hard terrain before finally coming to a screeching halt, leaving a trail of debris behind. The silence after the crash was eerie. The pilot sat still for a moment, his breathing heavy, the pounding of his heart louder than the fading wail of the alarms. He quickly unbuckled himself, assessing the damage. It wasn't good. His spacecraft was nearly torn in half, smoke and sparks sputtering from the mangled remains. No chance of repair. He grabbed his survival kit, standard-issue emergency supplies, rations, water, a basic tool set. Not much, but it would have to do. He stepped out onto the surface of the planet, the ground crunching beneath his boots. The air was thin, dry, and the landscape stretched out before him, a wasteland, utterly devoid of life. His first thought was how empty it felt. No trees, no signs of water, no signs of life. But he had survived worse. With a sigh, he pulled a small scanner from his kit and started to survey the area. He needed shelter. And fast. As he began to walk away from the wreckage, the scanner picked up faint readings, something unnatural. Tracks faint, but unmistakably made by something walking upright. They weren't human, and they weren't from any creature he recognized. The tracks were erratic, as if the being had been wandering aimlessly, perhaps for a long time. His heart quickened. He wasn't alone. He followed the trail, eyes sharp, every sense on high alert. The tracks led him over ridges and through rocky valleys, each step a reminder that this planet was harsh and unforgiving. Eventually, he spotted something in the distance, a figure small against the vast backdrop of the planet. As he drew closer, he could make out more details. It was a woman, though not like any woman he had ever seen. She was tall, with slender limbs and skin that shimmered faintly in the dim light. Her clothing, once clearly sophisticated and advanced, was torn and dirty. Her hair, if it could be called that, was a translucent silver, moving slightly as though in a constant breeze. She sat huddled in the shadow of a large rock formation, her knees drawn up to her chest, her eyes closed. The pilot approached cautiously, hands raised in a gesture of peace. She opened her eyes, startled by his presence. For a moment, they just stared at each other. She looked terrified, on the verge of bolting, but too weak to do so. She spoke, her voice shaky and in a language he couldn't understand. Her words were foreign, but her tone was clear, fear, desperation. He fumbled with the universal translator, hoping it would bridge the gap between them. A few moments later he spoke softly. "I'm not here to hurt you. I crashed here too. Are you all right?" The translator processed his words and transmitted a garbled version of them back to her in her own language. She seemed to understand, though she still looked wary. Slowly she began to speak again, her words translated back through the device. I didn't think there were others. Not here. Not after so long." Her voice cracked as if it had been a long time since she'd spoken. He glanced around, seeing the makeshift camp she had set up, A small, pitiful fire, a thin layer of cloth she must have been using for shelter. The pilot couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy. She had been here for far longer than him, and it showed. She continued, her words halting. I was exiled. Left here to die. My people, they thought I committed a terrible crime. But I didn't. I didn't do it. He crouched down beside her, keeping a respectful distance. Exiled? For what? They said I was dangerous, that I had powers. But I never did. It was all lies, politics. She lowered her gaze, her voice barely a whisper. They left me here. Alone. The pilot listened, the weight of her story settling in. It was clear that her people were advanced, far beyond his own civilization, but that didn't matter now. The planet had reduced them both to the same level, struggling survivors. He could see the fatigue in her eyes, the defeat. But he couldn't let her give up. Look, he said, keeping his tone gentle but firm. Whatever happened, it doesn't matter right now. We need to focus on surviving. We're both stuck here, but we're not alone anymore. I'll help you. She looked at him, uncertainty and hope flickering in her eyes. For the first time since he had found her, she didn't seem so afraid. Why would you help me? She asked quietly. The pilot shrugged. It's what humans do. We help. For a moment, the silence stretched between them. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. The pilot stood and extended his hand to her. She hesitated before taking it, her touch lighter than he expected. As she stood, it became clear just how weak she was. She had been surviving on the edge of collapse. Together, they began to gather what little resources they had. He shared some of his rations with her, and she ate sparingly, grateful but clearly still mistrusting. They worked in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The pilot scanned the horizon, trying to gauge how far they could go before nightfall. The planet's cycles were erratic, but he knew they couldn't stay out in the open for long. As they worked, she spoke again, softer this time. I don't know if we can make it. The planet, it's unforgiving. He glanced at her, a faint smile on his lips. We'll make it. I've survived worse. She didn't reply, but he could see a flicker of something in her, hope, perhaps, or at least the willingness to try. For now, that was enough. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. The cold would come soon, and with it more dangers. But as the two strangers prepared to face the night, there was a quiet understanding between them. They were in this together. And as long as they had each other, survival wasn't just a possibility, it was a promise. They had spent the night under a makeshift shelter, the cold seeping in despite their best efforts to keep warm. The pilot woke first, his mind already running through a checklist of what needed to be done. The alien woman still slept, though it was a restless sleep, her face etched with exhaustion. She had survived alone for weeks, but it was clear her body was near its limits. He needed to figure out a long-term plan, and fast. As she stirred awake, they sat together, sharing a quiet meal from his rations. He knew they couldn't rely on these for long. Water would be their next biggest challenge, and without power from his ship, they had no way to communicate with anyone, if there was even anyone out there. We need to figure out a plan, he said, breaking the silence. This planet isn't going to get any friendlier, and we can't stay here forever. First, we need shelter. Something better than this. He glanced at their haphazard setup, little more than a few scavenged panels propped against rocks. And I need to find a way to make use of what's left of the ship. The alien woman nodded, though it was clear she wasn't sure how they could pull it off. I don't know what else we can do. Your ship is destroyed, and I've been wandering for so long. There's nothing here. He wasn't about to give in to that kind of despair. There's always something. We just have to look harder. With that, he set to work. Over the next few hours, he dug into the wreckage of his ship, salvaging what he could. A few of the power cells were still functional, though their energy levels were dangerously low. He managed to jury-rig a basic energy converter from the broken components, just enough to power a small toolset. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The alien woman watched him work, her skepticism slowly giving way to curiosity. "You humans," she said quietly. "You never stop trying, do you?" He glanced over at her. "We've had to survive a lot worse. We didn't get where we are by giving up when things looked bad." She nodded, though her expression remained distant. It was clear she was still carrying the weight of her exile, the shame and the anger. But for now, she seemed willing to follow his lead. He noticed how frail she had become. Her hands shook slightly, and every movement seemed to take more effort than it should. The advanced technology of her people hadn't prepared her for the raw, physical toll of surviving in such a hostile place. Later, as they discussed how to ration their limited supplies, something on the horizon caught his eye. At first, it seemed like just another dust cloud, kicked up by the wind. But as it grew closer, he could make out dark shapes within it, something moving. He squinted, instinctively reaching for the makeshift spear he had fashioned earlier. "Get down!" he ordered, his voice low but urgent. The woman followed his gaze, her eyes widening in alarm. They crouched behind a rocky outcrop as the shapes drew closer. It didn't take long for him to identify them, creatures, large and predatory, their forms blurred by the swirling dust but unmistakably hunting. He counted at least 3 of them, their movements swift and deliberate, as though they had picked up their scent. "We have to move," he whispered. "They've found us." "What are they?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know, but they're not here to make friends." The creatures circled, their low growls carried on the wind. The pilot scanned the area, quickly calculating their options. Fleeing was too risky, these things were fast, and they had the terrain advantage. Fighting seemed like the only choice, and even then, the odds weren't great. But humans were good at stacking the odds in their favor. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice firm. The first creature lunged, its massive form crashing toward them with terrifying speed. The pilot didn't flinch, using the terrain to his advantage as he dodged to the side and drove his spear into the creature's flank. It let out a roar of pain, but it wasn't down yet. The others were closing in fast. He fought with a precision born of necessity, every move calculated to keep them at bay. His mind raced, searching for any possible advantage. The alien woman watched in awe, her fear momentarily forgotten as she saw the way he fought, not with brute strength, but with quick thinking and strategy. But then, just as one of the creatures prepared to strike, something happened. The air around them seemed to ripple, and the creature froze mid-lunge, suspended in the air for a brief moment before being thrown violently to the side. The pilot turned to see the alien woman, her eyes wide with shock, her hand outstretched. I didn't mean to," she stammered, staring at the fallen creature. He didn't have time to process what had just happened. The remaining creatures retreated, perhaps sensing they were outmatched. As the dust settled, he approached her slowly. "What was that?" he asked, though he had a good idea. She looked down at her hands, still trembling. "I don't know. I've never been able to do anything like that before." He didn't press her further. Whatever it was, it had saved their lives, and right now, that was all that mattered. After the encounter, their bond grew. In the quiet moments that followed, she began to talk more openly about her people, her exile, and the deep wounds it had left on her. She explained that her race valued logic above all else, and any display of emotion or unpredictability was seen as a weakness. That's why her people had feared her, because she was different. "They said I was dangerous," she murmured, her gaze distant. "That I had the potential to cause great harm. But I never understood why." The pilot listened quietly, his own thoughts swirling. It was clear now that there was more to her exile than she had initially let on. Whatever power she had, it was real, and it was something her people had wanted to suppress. But here, on this hostile planet, it was a gift. A way to survive. "You're not dangerous," he said softly. "You just need to learn how to control it." She looked at him, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "You really think so?" He nodded. "I've seen what you can do. It saved us back there." They both knew the planet wasn't going to let them rest. The creatures would come again, and next time, there would be more of them. The pilot began formulating a plan, his mind already calculating their next move. They couldn't stay here, not with the constant threat of attack. They needed to move, find a better position, maybe even a way off the planet. "We can't stay in one place," he said finally. "They'll keep coming. We need to keep moving, stay ahead of them." She agreed, though her uncertainty was still clear. They packed what little they had, preparing for the journey ahead. The terrain would be brutal, and the dangers were mounting, but they didn't have a choice. The pilot had survived worse odds before, and now, with her growing strength, they had a fighting chance. Together, they set off into the unforgiving landscape, their shared determination the only thing keeping them going. They were an unlikely pair, an exiled alien woman with a mysterious power, and a human pilot stranded far from home. But in this desolate world, they had each other. And that, for now, was enough. The journey across the planet was grueling, with each step feeling like a battle against the hostile environment. Sandstorms came without warning, ripping across the barren landscape and forcing them to find shelter in jagged rock formations. At times, the terrain was treacherous, sharp cliffs and crumbling earth, as if the planet itself was conspiring to make their passage impossible. But with each day, the alien woman grew stronger, her steps more sure, and her reliance on the pilot shifted from necessity to trust. The pilot noticed the change in her. At first, she had been hesitant, moving cautiously, her eyes constantly scanning for danger, as if expecting betrayal even from him. Now, she followed his lead more confidently, asking fewer questions when he made decisions and sometimes offering her own suggestions. She had begun to see the pilot not just as a fellow survivor, but as a leader. That trust was something fragile, but it grew with every challenge they faced. As they trudged through yet another dry valley, the woman spoke more openly about her people. She revealed details of their cold, clinical way of life, how emotions were seen as weaknesses, suppressed from an early age. Logic and efficiency were the only values that mattered. Her voice held a sadness as she spoke, though she tried to mask it. It was clear that the exile had done more than strip her of her status. It had forced her to confront everything she had been taught to believe. "Your people are so different," she remarked one day as they rested under the shade of a large boulder. "You're driven by things that would be considered liabilities in my world. Compassion, stubbornness, hope. We were always told those things lead to chaos. And yet, I'm starting to wonder if maybe that's why we failed." The pilot smiled faintly. "We're not perfect, but humans have always found a way to survive, usually by leaning on each other. We don't suppress what makes us human, even when it complicates things." She nodded, deep in thought, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something new in her, a quiet questioning of everything she once believed. It wasn't just survival they were talking about anymore. It was something deeper, a questioning of identity, values, and what it meant to truly live. As they neared a place of relative safety, a cave they had spotted in the distance, the pilot grew tense. He had felt it gnawing at him for days now, something in the back of his mind he couldn't shake. His ship's systems had finally decrypted the sealed orders he hadn't even known existed, and what he saw had sent a chill down his spine. Now, the time had come to tell her the truth. When they reached the cave, the pilot sat down, his expression unusually serious. The alien woman sensed the shift in his demeanor immediately, her brow furrowing in concern. "What's wrong?" she asked. He hesitated, unsure of how to say it. "There's something you need to know. I wasn't just a random pilot who crash-landed here. I was sent to find you." Her eyes widened, confusion and wariness flickering across her face. "Sent by whom?" "By your people," he said slowly, his voice steady but weighted with the gravity of the revelation. "I didn't know at first. My orders were sealed, hidden in my ship's systems. I thought I was on a routine mission, but when I crashed, those orders were triggered. They were just decrypted recently." She stood there in stunned silence, trying to process the weight of his words. "You're saying, my own people sent you to find me?" "Why?" "They exiled me." He met her gaze, his expression soft but resolute. It wasn't just exile. They wanted you gone because they feared you. The truth is, they knew you had a latent power, something that could become dangerous if it was fully realized. They couldn't risk having you around, but they also didn't want to completely abandon the possibility of using that power if it ever manifested. Her eyes darkened, a mixture of disbelief and anger taking hold. So they sent you to, what? Monitor me? Kill me if I became too dangerous? No, the pilot said quickly, shaking his head. I wasn't sent here to harm you. I was supposed to help you unlock that power. If you did, I was to bring you back. If not, well, they assumed the planet would take care of the problem on its own. The alien woman's face twisted in a combination of hurt and betrayal. She stepped back, her voice rising. So all this time, you've just been following their orders? This was never about helping me. You were just a tool, another part of their plan. The pilot stood, reaching out a hand to her, though he knew she might reject it. I didn't know, I swear. I thought I was just a pilot stuck here like you. But even after finding out, I'm still here with you. I didn't leave, I didn't turn on you. I want to help you, not because of their orders, but because I believe you deserve the chance to make your own choices. She looked at him, her eyes filled with conflict. Her trust had been shaken, the bond they had built now laced with doubt. I don't know if I can believe that. I understand, he said softly. But think about it. Your people feared you for a reason, but that doesn't mean you're dangerous. It just means you have potential. They wanted to control you, but maybe now you can decide what to do with it. Her gaze dropped, the weight of everything pressing down on her. What if they were right? What if I am dangerous? He took a step closer, his voice firm but gentle. You're not dangerous. You're powerful. There's a difference. And I think that power is exactly what we need to survive this place, and maybe to change what your people thought about you. After a long silence, she finally looked up, her expression softening. What now? The pilot reached into his pack and pulled out a small device, one of the few items he had salvaged from the wreckage. This was part of my orders. It's a key, or rather, it's part of the reason you were exiled. It contains information about your powers, instructions on how to awaken them. Your people knew you were different, special, and they wanted to keep that under control. But now it's in your hands. She stared at the device, as if it held the answers to all her questions, and perhaps, all her fears. I don't know if I want this, she whispered, her voice trembling with uncertainty. I don't know if I want to be what they fear. The pilot placed the device in her hands. That's for you to decide. But if we're going to get off this planet, we're going to need every advantage we can get. I'll be with you every step of the way, whatever you choose. She clutched the device tightly, her emotions swirling in her eyes, fear, anger, hope. So, this is my redemption? She asked, half to herself. Maybe, he said quietly. Or maybe it's a new beginning. You don't have to go back to them, you know. You could forge your own path. The idea seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy and charged with possibilities. For the first time, she wasn't just thinking about survival. She was thinking about what came after. They stood there together, the horizon stretching endlessly before them, the dangers still lurking but somehow feeling less daunting now. They had a new goal, a new sense of purpose. Whether it was redemption or something entirely new, only time would tell. But for now, they were ready to face it, together. The landscape stretched before them, barren and unyielding as always, but this time, there was a faint glimmer of hope on the horizon. The pilot and the alien woman had found what seemed like a path to escape, a narrow pass between two towering cliffs that led toward what the pilot suspected was a cave system. If they could reach it, they might find shelter or even a way off the planet. But the sense of dread that had been looming since the start of their journey now thickened around them. They both felt it. As they neared the pass, the air seemed to shift, a strange hum vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. The pilot stopped, his eyes scanning the distant ridges. He knew it wasn't just the planet's natural unease, it was something else, something more dangerous. Before he could voice his warning, the creatures emerged. They came from all directions, surrounding them like a pack of wolves closing in on prey. Bigger than the ones they had encountered before, more feral, their dark forms rippling with muscle and bone, driven by primal instinct. The low growls that filled the air confirmed what the pilot had suspected. They had been hunted, and now it was time for the final strike. "There's too many," the alien woman whispered, her voice shaking as her eyes darted from one creature to another. Her breath quickened, and the tension in her frame was palpable. They were cornered, outnumbered, and she knew that despite all the pilot's skill, they wouldn't be able to fend off this many. But the pilot's resolve was unshaken. "We've survived this long. We'll get through this too," he said, gripping his makeshift weapon with a steely determination. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of urgency as he prepared for the fight. They couldn't run now, this was it. The first creature lunged, and the pilot met it head-on, driving his weapon into its thick hide with all the force he could muster. But the others closed in fast, too fast for him to fend off alone. One of them swiped at him from the side, claws narrowly missing as he dodged and struck again, his movements quick but increasingly desperate. The alien woman stood frozen for a moment, fear paralyzing her as she watched the onslaught. She wanted to help, to fight, but the weight of her own uncertainty held her back. Until it didn't. As another creature lunged at the pilot, time seemed to slow. The air around the woman shifted, rippling with an unseen force. In an instant, a blast of energy erupted from her, sending the creature flying backward, its massive form crashing into the rocks with a sickening thud. She stood there, wide-eyed and breathless, her hands still outstretched as if she couldn't believe what she had just done. The pilot, barely managing to hold his ground, glanced at her, eyes wide with both shock and gratitude. "Now's the time," he called, urgency thick in his voice. "You've got to use it." She swallowed hard, her mind racing. The fear that had kept her power locked away was fading, replaced by something else, resolve. She had spent so long fearing what she might be capable of, but now she had no choice. This was survival, and she was done running from herself. With a deep breath, she focused, feeling the strange, unfamiliar energy within her stir again. Another creature charged toward them, and this time, she was ready. A force field rippled into existence around her and the pilot, deflecting the attack. The creature bounced off it as if hitting an invisible wall, snarling in frustration as it circled them. But they weren't safe yet. The creatures were relentless, driven by hunger and instinct, and more of them emerged from the shadows, their sheer numbers overwhelming. The pilot fought with everything he had, but even he could feel the weight of the battle pressing down. His body ached from the strain, and the creatures seemed endless. The woman, now fully aware of the power coursing through her, began to push herself further. Her control was shaky at first, but with every pulse of energy she released, it became more refined, more deliberate. She hurled creatures away with flicks of her hand, barriers springing up and dissolving as needed. But it wasn't enough. The tide of creatures kept coming, and they were wearing down. The pilot's weapon was chipped and bent from the constant strikes, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We need to end this now," the pilot grunted, driving his spear into another creature's side. "We can't keep this up." The alien woman nodded, understanding immediately. She had to tap into the full extent of her power, even if she didn't fully understand it yet. It was the only way. She closed her eyes, shutting out the chaos around her, and focused on the deep, untapped well of energy within. The ground beneath them trembled as the air seemed to vibrate, the creatures sensing a shift in the balance. When she opened her eyes again, there was a calm intensity in them, a clarity of purpose. The creatures lunged one final time, but they didn't make it far. With a single, concentrated push, the air exploded around them, sending a shockwave across the landscape. The creatures were thrown back, their bodies crashing into the rocks and each other, unable to withstand the sheer force of her power. For a moment, everything was still. The creatures lay scattered, defeated, their snarls replaced by an eerie silence. The pilot, panting and bloodied, slowly lowered his weapon. He glanced around at the devastation, then back at the woman. She stood tall, her chest rising and falling with exhaustion, but there was something different about her now. She was no longer the exiled outcast, fearful of her own abilities. She had faced the worst this planet had to offer, and had come out the other side stronger. "You did it," the pilot said, his voice filled with both admiration and relief. "We did it." She nodded, still catching her breath, but there was a faint smile on her lips. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she didn't feel helpless. She felt powerful, in control. But as the adrenaline began to fade, the weight of what they had just been through settled over them. They had survived the worst of the planet's dangers, but their journey wasn't over yet. The escape route lay just ahead, and now, with her powers fully awakened, they had a chance, more than a chance. Together, they were stronger than any threat this planet could throw at them. As they walked toward the pass, side by side, the pilot couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride, not just for her, but for humanity as well. His mission had been more than just surviving. It had been about proving that even in the darkest corners of the universe, humans could make a difference, could help others rise to their potential. She turned to him as they neared the cave, her eyes softening. "I don't know what happens next," she said quietly, "but I'm not afraid anymore." He smiled. "That's what makes all the difference." In that moment, the alien woman found her redemption, not just in the eyes of her people or the universe, but within herself. And as the sun set over the distant horizon, they stepped into the unknown, ready to face whatever came next, together. Humanity had proven, once again, that its spirit was unbreakable.